He had told himself it was just about sorting through the old furniture, making decisions about what to keep and what to let go. That was what he said when his sister called, asking if he would handle their mother's estate. The house had been empty for 2 years now, standing quiet at the edge of a town that barely remembered either of them. He could have hired someone, could have signed papers from a distance, but instead he found himself driving north on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching the landscape shift from highway sprawl to something older, more patient. He did not let himself think about the fact that she might still be living nearby. He did not let himself wonder if she ever thought about that summer, or if time had been kinder to her than it had been to him. The house looked smaller than he remembered. It sat back from the road, framed by oak trees that had grown thick and tall, their branches now reaching across the gravel drive like old friends offering a hesitant embrace. The paint had faded to a soft grey blue, and the shutters hung slightly crooked, but the bones of the place were still strong. He stood in front of the door for longer than necessary, his hand on the cold metal of the key his sister had mailed him, and felt something tighten in his chest. It was not nostalgia exactly, though that was part of it. It was the particular weight of returning to a place that had once held the shape of a life he might have lived. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood, and something faintly floral that he could not name. The furniture was covered in sheets, pale ghosts arranged throughout the rooms, and the light coming through the windows fell in long, slanted bars across the floor. He set his bag down in the hallway and walked slowly through the space, his footsteps loud in the silence. The kitchen still had the same yellow curtains his mother had sewn decades ago. The living room still had the fireplace, with the chipped mantel where they used to leave notes for each other, tiny folded squares of paper that said things like, "Gone to the store" or "Back by dinner." He opened the drawer of the side table and found one there still, yellowed and brittle. It was in her handwriting. It said, "Thank you for yesterday." He did not remember what yesterday had been, but he remembered her handwriting, the particular way she looped her letters, the small flourish at the end of each word. He remembered watching her write in a notebook on the back porch, her head bent in concentration, her hair falling forward to hide her face. He remembered wanting to reach out and tuck that hair behind her ear, and the way he had stopped himself, his hand frozen halfway across the space between them, before pulling back and pretending he had been reaching for his coffee instead. She had been his mother's friend's daughter, which was how these things always began in small towns. Their families had known each other loosely, the way people do when they share a church or a school district, and one summer when he was 23 and she was 21, both of them back from college and unsure what came next, they ended up at the house together more often than not. His mother liked having people around. She would invite them for dinners that stretched long into the evening, for weekend projects that required extra hands, for no reason at all except that the house felt too quiet otherwise. He and the young woman whose name he had not said aloud in years fell into an easy rhythm. They painted the porch. They pulled weeds from the garden. They sat on the back steps in the evenings and talked about books and travel and all the places they thought they might go. He had loved her, he thought, though he had never said it. There had been moments when the words were right there, when he could feel them forming in his throat, but he always let them dissolve before they reached the air. She had a boyfriend back at school, someone serious, someone she mentioned in passing the way people mention weather. He told himself that was reason enough to stay quiet. He told himself he was being respectful, mature, that real affection meant not imposing, not complicating her life. But the truth, which he understood only later, was that he had been afraid of the vulnerability, afraid of changing something that felt so easy and light, afraid that saying the words would break whatever fragile thing existed between them. The summer had been unusually warm that year, the kind of heat that made everything slow down and shimmer. They worked on the house in the early mornings and late afternoons, avoiding the brutal midday sun, and in between they found ways to fill the time. They drove to the lake 20 minutes away and sat on the rocky shore, not swimming, just watching the water move. They walked through the town's small downtown, stopping in the used bookstore where the owner knew everyone's name and always had coffee brewing in the back. They helped his mother prepare elaborate meals that the three of them would eat on the screened porch, listening to the cicadas and the distant sound of traffic on the county road. His mother had noticed, of course. Mothers always did. She would watch the two of them with a small, knowing smile, and sometimes she would make excuses to leave them alone, claiming she needed to run errands or visit a neighbor. He appreciated her discretion, even as it terrified him, because her absence meant he had to fill the silence, had to navigate the weight of being alone with someone who made his heart beat faster just by walking into a room. They talked about everything except what mattered. They talked about the books they were reading, about professors they had loved or hated, about whether they believed in fate or free will or something in between. She told him about growing up in the next town over, about her parents' quiet disappointment that she had chosen art history instead of something practical, about her dream of working in a museum someday, restoring old paintings, bringing faded colors back to life. He told her about his own uncertainty, about the engineering degree that felt more like a default choice than a calling, about his fear that he would end up in a job that paid well but meant nothing. She listened in a way that made him feel heard, really heard, and sometimes she would ask questions that cut right to the heart of what he was trying to say. She had a way of tilting her head when she was thinking, a way of pausing before she spoke, as if she was weighing each word carefully. He found himself talking more than he usually did, saying things he had not said to anyone. And afterward, he would lie awake at night wondering if he had revealed too much, if she could see through him to the longing he was trying so hard to hide. There were moments when he thought she felt it too, little things, barely noticeable except that he was paying attention to everything. The way she would lean closer when they sat on the porch steps, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The way she laughed at his jokes, even the ones that were not particularly funny. The way she looked at him sometimes, her gaze lingering just a fraction too long, as if she was trying to solve some puzzle she had not quite figured out yet. One night in early August, they stayed up late working on a jigsaw puzzle his mother had started and abandoned. It was a landscape, all green hills and blue sky, maddeningly difficult because so many pieces looked identical. They sat at the dining room table with the windows open, letting in the cool night air, and worked in comfortable silence punctuated by small victories when a piece finally fit. Around midnight, she found the last corner piece and held it up triumphantly, and he laughed and reached across the table to take it from her, and their fingers touched. It was nothing, just a brief contact, but he felt it all the way through his body like an electric current. She went still, her hand in his, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then she pulled away gently and said something about needing to get home, and he drove her back to her parents' house through dark, empty streets, both of them quiet, the air in the car heavy with everything unsaid. He almost told her that night. He walked her to her door and stood there in the porch light, and the words were right there, so close. But then her mother called from inside asking if that was her, and the moment fractured and disappeared. She smiled at him, a little sadly, he thought, and said good night, and he drove home gripping the steering wheel too hard, furious with himself for his cowardice. August ended, and she went back to school, and he took a job in a city 3 hours away, and they promised to stay in touch. They did, for a while. She sent him emails about her classes, about a new coffee shop she had found, about an exhibit she had seen that made her think of their conversations. He wrote back with updates about work, about the apartment he had rented, about how strange it felt to be living somewhere new. But the emails grew less frequent, the space between them longer, until finally they stopped altogether. He heard through his mother that she had graduated, that she had gotten engaged to the serious boyfriend, that she was moving to another state for a job. He sent her a congratulations card that felt hollow and inadequate, and she sent back a brief thank you note, and that was the end of it. The years passed in the way they do, quickly and slowly at the same time. He built a career, moved from city to city following opportunities, dated people who were nice but never quite right. He learned to live with the low-level ache of wondering what might have been, the way you learn to live with an old injury that flares up in certain weather. Sometimes he would think about that summer and feel a sharp pang of regret. Other times he would convince himself he had romanticized it, that it had not been as significant as he remembered, that he had built it up into something larger than life simply because it was unfinished. His mother called him every Sunday, and sometimes she would mention the young woman in passing, small updates that felt like test balloons to see how he would react. She was living in Philadelphia now. She was teaching. She had gotten divorced. His mother never said it directly, but he could hear the question underneath the information, the gentle prodding toward something she thought he should do. He never took the bait. He would say something non-committal and change the subject, and his mother would sigh in that particular way mothers do when they think their children are being stubborn. When his mother got sick, it happened fast. 1 month she was fine, the next she was in the hospital, and 6 weeks later she was gone. He came back to the house for the funeral and stayed only as long as necessary, moving through the rituals in a fog of grief that surprised him with its intensity. He had not realized how much he had relied on those Sunday phone calls, on his mother's steady presence in his life, until she was no longer there. His sister handled most of the estate details initially, but after 2 years of the house sitting empty, she called and said it was time to make final decisions. She had her own family, her own life in another state, and she did not want the responsibility. Would he take care of it? Would he sort through what remained and decide what to do with the place? He should have said no. He should have hired an estate sale company and been done with it. But something made him say yes, some pull he could not quite name. And now here he was, standing in the middle of his childhood home, surrounded by memories he had spent 20 years trying to forget. The first day he worked mechanically, opening closets and drawers, sorting items into piles. Keep, donate, trash. His mother had been a saver, and the house was full of things that had no clear purpose but that she had held on to anyway. Old magazines, empty jars, stacks of greeting cards from decades past. He filled garbage bags and made notes of furniture that would need to be hauled away, and tried not to let himself feel anything beyond the simple physical effort of the task. But the house would not let him maintain that distance. In the linen closet, he found a scarf she had left behind that final August, soft blue wool that still smelled faintly of her perfume even after all these years. In the bookshelf, he found a paperback novel she had lent him, her name written inside the cover in that distinctive looping script, and a small notation in the margin on page 47 that said, "This reminds me of our conversation about inevitability." He did not remember the conversation, but he remembered sitting with her on the porch, the way the evening light had caught in her hair, the way she had gestured with her hands when she got excited about an idea. In the desk in his mother's bedroom, he found a photograph from that summer. It was one he had never seen before, though he recognized it instantly. They were standing in the garden, both of them holding rakes, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. Her hand was almost touching his arm, not quite making contact, suspended in that small space between them. He stood there holding the photograph for a long time, studying their younger faces, trying to read in their expressions what they had been too afraid to say aloud. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in his old bedroom listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the oak trees, and let himself remember, not just the broad strokes of that summer, but the details, the way she had hummed while she worked unconsciously, some melody he had never been able to identify, the way she took her coffee with too much sugar and a splash of milk, the way she had looked at him once, really looked at him, when he was talking about something he cared about and said, "I like the way you see things. You notice what other people miss." He had carried that compliment with him for 20 years, taking it out occasionally like a talisman, proof that maybe he had not imagined the connection between them. But he had never done anything with it, never let it mean what it might have meant. And now all that remained was this house full of ghosts and a scarf that still smelled like her, and a photograph of 2 people who had been too young and too scared to reach across the small distance that separated them. On the second day, he went into town to meet with the estate lawyer. It was a brief appointment, just paperwork and signatures, administrative details that required his physical presence. When he finished, he found himself walking the main street with no particular destination. The town had not changed much. There was a new coffee shop where the old hardware store used to be, a bright modern space that looked out of place among the older buildings. The bakery had repainted, going from white to a cheerful yellow. But the rhythm of the place was the same, that particular small-town pace that felt both comforting and suffocating, depending on his mood. He stopped at the bookstore on the corner, the same one they used to visit that summer. The owner had changed, but the store itself was remarkably similar. Still cramped and overstuffed, still smelling of old paper and coffee. He browsed without intent, moving down narrow aisles, letting his fingers trail across spines. He was in the gardening section, not even sure why he had wandered there, when he looked up and saw her standing 3 feet away, holding a book about heirloom vegetables. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and he could not move, could not speak, could barely breathe. Then she smiled, and it was careful, the kind of smile that acknowledged time and distance and everything that had passed between them, and she said his name like a question. They stood in the narrow aisle and exchanged the basic facts of their lives, the kind of information you share with someone you once knew well but have not spoken to in years. She still lived nearby, just a few towns over, in a small house she had bought after her divorce. She was teaching at the elementary school, 3rd grade, and she liked it more than she had thought she would. She asked about his work, about his life, about his mother, and he gave her the abbreviated version, the one that sounded complete but left out all the important parts. There was a moment of silence, slightly awkward, and then she said, "Are you staying at the house?" He said yes, just for the week, sorting through his mother's things. She nodded, and something shifted in her expression, something he could not quite read. She said, "I drive past it sometimes. It always looks so peaceful." He did not know what to say to that. The house had held so much for both of them, had been the container for everything they had felt and not said, and the idea that she thought about it, that she drove past it, made something tighten in his chest. She bought her book, and he bought nothing, and they walked out of the store together into the cool October air. The coffee shop was right there, the new one, and she asked if he wanted to get coffee, and he said yes before he could think better of it. They sat in the window at a small table that wobbled slightly and talked about easier things. She told him about her students, about the satisfaction of teaching children how to read, how to think. He told her about a project he was working on, a bridge design that was proving more complicated than expected. They talked about the town, about people they had both known, about the strange experience of returning to a place that held so many memories. But underneath the surface conversation, he could feel the old current, the thing that had always existed between them, still there and humming quietly. He could see it in the way she looked at him, in the pauses between sentences, in the way her hand moved restlessly around her coffee cup. And he knew she could feel it too, could see it in the careful way she chose her words, in the things she was not saying. When she stood to leave, she hesitated, her hand on the back of the chair, and she said, "If you need help with anything at the house, I could come by." He should have said no. He should have thanked her politely and let her leave and finished his work alone, but instead he heard himself say, "That would be nice, if you have time." She smiled, and this time it was less careful, more genuine. She said, "I'll come tomorrow afternoon, if that works." He said it worked. That night, alone in the house again, he sat in his mother's favorite chair and tried to understand what he was doing. She would be here tomorrow. They would be in this house together, surrounded by all the memories of that summer, and he had no idea what would happen. He told himself it was just practical help, just an old friend offering assistance with a difficult task. But he knew it was more than that. He knew that seeing her again had cracked something open in him, some carefully maintained wall he had built to protect himself from the pain of what he had lost. He thought about that summer, about all the moments when he could have said something and did not. He thought about the night with the jigsaw puzzle, about her hand in his, about the way she had looked at him. He thought about the emails they had exchanged, growing shorter and more distant until they stopped altogether. He thought about the years that had passed, about the life she had built and then dismantled, about his own careful existence that had never quite felt complete. And he thought about tomorrow, about her coming here, about what it would mean to be in this space together again. She arrived in the early afternoon, dressed in jeans and a sweater the color of autumn leaves, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look both older and exactly the same. She stepped into the house and stood in the hallway for a moment, not moving, just looking around with an expression he could not read. Then she said, "It even smells the same." He led her upstairs to the attic, where most of the remaining work needed to be done. His mother had stored decades' worth of items up there, boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture pushed against the walls, everything covered in a thick layer of dust. They started sorting methodically, pulling boxes down one at a time, opening them, deciding what to keep and what to discard. It was easier with two people. The task felt less heavy, less overwhelming, and they fell into a rhythm that felt familiar, comfortable, like something they had done many times before. She was practical and decisive, making quick judgments about what mattered and what did not, and he appreciated her efficiency. They worked mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that exists between people who know each other well enough that constant conversation is not necessary. She found a box of his old college textbooks and laughed, holding up a biology tome with a cracked spine and pages yellowed with age. She said, "Did you ever actually read this?" He said, "I must have. I passed the class." She flipped through it, pausing at a page where he had made notes in the margin, and said, "Your handwriting hasn't changed." He found a box labeled in his mother's handwriting that said simply, "Summer Things." Inside were various items from different years, beach towels and sunscreen and a badminton set they had used once and then forgotten, and underneath those items, wrapped in tissue paper, were her charcoal drawings from that summer, sketches of the garden, of the oak trees, of the view from the back porch, studies of light and shadow, rendered in soft, careful strokes that showed real talent. He took them out carefully and held them, and she went very quiet. She came over and looked at the drawings, her face unreadable, and then she took them from his hands and flipped through them slowly. She said, "I forgot I left these here." He wanted to ask why she had never come back for them, why his mother had kept them all these years, but he did not. Instead, he watched her face as she studied her own work from 2 decades ago, and he saw something complicated move across her expression, something that looked like both fondness and regret. She set the drawings aside gently and said, "I was so sure of myself that summer, so certain I knew what I wanted." He waited, not speaking, sensing that she was navigating towards something important. She continued, her voice quiet. "I had this whole plan mapped out. I was going to finish school, marry David, move to wherever his career took us, maybe fit my own work in around the edges. It all seemed so clear, so logical." She paused, looking at the drawings again. "And then I spent that summer here, with you and your mother, and suddenly nothing felt clear anymore." His heart was beating very fast. He kept his hands busy with the box in front of him, not looking at her, giving her space to say whatever she needed to say. She said, "I used to lie awake at night in my childhood bedroom, after you'd drive me home, and think about what it would mean to stay here, to choose something different, to choose." She trailed off, and he could hear her take a breath. "But I was afraid of disrupting the plan, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of what it would mean to admit I wanted something I wasn't supposed to want." He finally looked at her then, and saw that her eyes were bright, not quite crying, but close. He said softly, "What did you want?" She met his gaze, and the air between them felt charged, dangerous. She said, "I think you know." He did know. He had always known. But hearing her say it, even obliquely, even after all these years, felt like standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying. All the words he had never said were there in his throat, crowding and urgent, but before he could force any of them out, she turned away and said, "We should keep working, there's still a lot to sort through." They spent the rest of the afternoon in that careful dance, working side by side, occasionally brushing against each other in the cramped attic space, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence. They found more things that triggered memories, a board game they had played on rainy afternoons, a tool set they had used to fix the porch railing, a picnic basket his mother had packed for a trip to the lake, that never happened because of a sudden thunderstorm. Each object was a small doorway into the past, and they moved through them carefully, acknowledging but not dwelling, maintaining the fragile equilibrium between remembering and surviving the act of remembering. When the light started to fade, they took a break and went downstairs. He made coffee, the simple act of it giving him something to do with his hands. and they sat on the back steps, just as they had so many times before. The garden was overgrown now, wild and untended, the careful beds his mother had maintained completely overrun with weeds and volunteer plants. But the light still fell across it in the same soft golden way, and the oak trees still rustled in the breeze, and sitting there next to her felt like stepping outside of time entirely. She said without looking at him, "I used to think about this place a lot after I left." He waited, not daring to speak, afraid that words would break whatever fragile thing was forming. She continued, "I would be in the middle of some completely ordinary moment, teaching a class or grocery shopping or sitting in traffic, and suddenly I would remember something. The way the light looked through the kitchen windows in the morning, the sound of cicadas in the evening, your mother's laugh." She paused. "The way you looked at me sometimes when you thought I wasn't paying attention." His breath caught. He stared at the overgrown garden and did not move. She said, "I was married for 8 years to a good man who loved me, and I spent every single one of those years thinking about you." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and irrevocable. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, could feel the weight of everything he had never said pressing against his ribs. He turned to look at her and saw that she was crying now, silently, tears tracking down her cheeks. She said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty or to change anything. Her voice broke slightly. "I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud, just once, that you weren't alone in what you felt, that it mattered, that it still matters." He reached for her hand before he could stop himself, his fingers closing around hers, and she gripped back hard, almost desperately. They sat there on the steps holding on to each other, and he felt 20 years of silence finally breaking apart. He said, his voice rough, "I loved you. That whole summer. Every single day." She made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. He said, "I told myself I was being respectful, that I was doing the right thing by not interfering in your life. But the truth is I was just afraid. Afraid you didn't feel the same way. Afraid of what it would mean if you did. Afraid of—" He struggled to find the words. "Afraid of how much I needed you." She turned to face him fully then, her hand still in his, her face wet with tears. She said, "I felt the same way. Exactly the same way. And I was just as afraid." They looked at each other, really looked for the first time in 20 years, and he saw in her eyes all the longing and regret and tender hope that he felt in his own chest. It would have been easy to lean forward, to close the distance between them, to kiss her the way he had wanted to kiss her 2 decades ago. But something made him pause, made him hold back, because this moment felt too important to rush, too significant to collapse into simple physical action. He said, "What happens now?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know." They sat there as the light faded, still holding hands, and neither of them had an answer. The practical realities were complicated. She had a life here, a job she cared about, a house she had just bought. He had a life elsewhere, commitments and responsibilities that could not simply be abandoned. They were not 23 and 21 anymore, not free to remake their lives on a whim. They were older, more cautious, more aware of everything that could go wrong. But they were also here, together, finally saying the things they should have said so long ago. She said eventually, "I don't want to walk away again. I don't want to spend another 20 years wondering what if." He said, "Neither do I." It was not a solution. It was barely even a plan, but it was honest, and it was real, and it was more than they had ever allowed themselves before. She left as it got fully dark, but this time when she drove away he stood in the driveway watching until her taillights disappeared. And it felt different. It felt like a beginning rather than an ending. He went back inside and sat in the quiet house and let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. They had said the words. They had acknowledged what had always been between them, and now they would have to figure out what came next. Over the following days she came back to help him finish sorting through the house. They worked together efficiently, making steady progress through the remaining boxes and closets, but underneath the practical work, something else was happening. They were learning each other again, filling in the gaps of 20 years, discovering who they had become in all the time they had been apart. She told him about her marriage, About how it had been good in many ways but fundamentally incomplete. About the moment she had finally admitted to herself that she was living someone else's life. She told him about the divorce, which had been sad but not devastating, more like acknowledging a truth they had both known for a while. She told him about buying her house, about the satisfaction of choosing her own paint colors and arranging furniture exactly how she wanted, about building a life that was entirely her own. He told her about his own string of relationships, none of which had quite worked, about the way he always seemed to find something wrong, some reason why it could not last. He told her about his work, about the satisfaction of solving complex engineering problems, about the loneliness of moving from city to city, following opportunities that looked good on paper, but never quite felt right. He told her about the phone calls with his mother, about how she had always asked about him in a way that suggested she was really asking if he was happy, and how he had never quite known how to answer. They talked about their regrets, about the choices they wished they had made differently, about the years they had lost. But they also talked about what they had learned, about the ways they had grown, about the fact that maybe they needed those 20 years to become people who could actually handle what they felt for each other. One afternoon, they took a break from sorting and walked to the lake where they used to go that summer. It was colder now, late October turning toward November, and the water was grey and choppy under a cloudy sky. They sat on the same rocky shore where they had sat 2 decades ago, and the silence between them was comfortable, easy, full of everything they had finally learned to say. She said, "The house. Are you selling it?" He had been thinking about that question for days. The logical answer was yes, it was the practical thing, the clean thing, but sitting here with her, thinking about everything the house had held for both of them, he was not sure. He said, "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should. It's too much space for one person, and I don't live here anyway." He paused, "But part of me thinks maybe I should keep it, at least for a while." She looked at him and he could see her understanding what he was not quite saying. The house was not just a building. It was the place where they had been their truest selves, even in silence. It was the place that had held their unspoken feelings for 20 years, keeping them safe until they were finally ready to claim them. She said, "You could come back sometimes, even if you don't live here full-time." He said, "I could." She said, "And I'm only 20 minutes away." He said, "I know." They looked at each other, and there was a current of possibility running between them, something tentative and fragile but real. He said, "I don't know how to make this work, practically, I mean. My job is 3 hours away. Your life is here. He struggled for the words. "I don't want to ask you to change everything for me." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. She said, "What if we just start small? What if we just see each other and figure it out as we go and stop trying to have all the answers right away?" It was such a simple idea, and yet it had never occurred to him. He had spent so much of his life trying to plan everything, trying to make sure he knew the ending before he began, that the idea of simply moving forward without certainty felt both terrifying and liberating. He said, "Okay." She smiled, and it was the first fully unguarded smile he had seen from her, and it made him feel like he was 23 again, sitting on the porch steps, falling in love without meaning to. They stayed at the lake until the sun started to set, and then they drove back to the house together. That night, for the first time, she did not leave. They sat on the couch in the living room and talked until late, and when it got cold he built a fire in the fireplace, and they sat in front of it not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him. Eventually, exhausted from the emotional weight of the past few days, they both fell asleep there, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, the fire burning low, the house quiet around them. He woke sometime before dawn to find her still sleeping, her breathing slow and even, and he let himself look at her in the dim light. Her face was peaceful, younger somehow in sleep, and he felt a surge of tenderness so strong it almost hurt. He had spent 20 years regretting this woman, mourning what they had not had, and now she was here, real and warm and present, and he understood with sudden clarity that they were getting a gift most people never received. They were getting a second chance, When she woke, they made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the light change, not talking much, just being together in the quiet. She had to leave eventually, had to go home and change for work, and when she stood to go, he walked her to her car. She paused with her hand on the door handle and said, "When do you have to go back?" He had initially planned to leave in 2 days, to finish up the house and return to his job. But standing here with her, he found himself reassessing. He said, "I can stay longer, if you want." She said, "I want." He kissed her then, finally, after 20 years of not kissing her. It was soft and careful, and full of all the tenderness he had been holding on to for so long. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. And he realized he was smiling too, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Over the next week, they fell into a new rhythm. She came over after work most days, and they continued sorting through the house, but also they just existed together in the space, cooking meals, reading quietly in the same room, taking walks through the property. They were learning the ordinary reality of being together, the small daily negotiations and compromises, and he found that he liked it even more than he had liked the idealized version he had carried in his head. They talked about the future more concretely. He could not simply quit his job, but he had accumulated vacation time and could work remotely occasionally. She suggested he keep the house, at least for now, use it as a base when he came back to visit. They could see each other on weekends, could build something slowly and carefully, testing whether this thing between them could survive the reality of daily life and distance, and all the complications they were bringing to it. It was not a perfect solution, it was not the fairy tale version where everything aligned easily, but it was real, and it was honest, and it was theirs. On his last night before returning to the city, they sat on the back steps one more time. The garden was still overgrown, but he had started to clear some of the worst of the weeds, and she had helped him plant a few bulbs that would come up in the spring. It was a small gesture toward the future, an acknowledgement that this place would continue to exist, that they would both be part of it. She said, "I'm afraid." He said, "Me too." She said, "What if it doesn't work? What if we're too different now, or too old, or too set in our ways?" He said, "Then at least we'll know. At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat there in the gathering dark, listening to the wind in the oak trees. He left the next morning early, and she stood in the driveway waving until he could not see her anymore in the rearview mirror. The drive back felt different than the drive up had felt. He was leaving, but he was also returning to something, carrying with him the knowledge that she was there, that she would be waiting, that they had finally said the words that needed to be said. Over the following months they made it work. He came back every few weeks, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for longer stretches when he could arrange remote work. They video called in between, long rambling conversations late at night, and they texted throughout the day, small updates and observations and inside jokes that only made sense to them. It was not always easy. There were times when the distance felt crushing, when they both wondered if they were being foolish, trying to build something on such an unstable foundation. But there were also moments of deep joy, moments when he would arrive at the house and she would already be there waiting, or when they would be talking on the phone and fall into such natural conversation that hours would pass without either of them noticing. Slowly, carefully, they built something real. Not the passionate romance of their youth, but something deeper, more mature, grounded in honest knowledge of who they actually were, rather than who they had imagined each other to be. They learned each other's habits and quirks, their morning routines and evening rituals, their ways of navigating stress and conflict. They had their first argument about something small and stupid, and then they worked through it, both of them committed to not letting silence build between them again. By the time spring arrived, he had made a decision. He gave notice at his job, found new work closer to the town, started making plans to move back permanently. It was a risk, leaving a career he had built over years, relocating his entire life for a relationship that was still relatively new. But sitting in his apartment in the city, he realized that what he had been calling stability was actually just inertia, and what felt risky was actually the first truly brave thing he had done in decades. When he told her, she cried. Happy tears this time, tears of relief and joy, and she said, "Are you sure?" I don't want you to give up everything for me. He said, I'm not giving up anything. I'm finally choosing what actually matters. He moved back on a warm day in May. She helped him unpack boxes in the house that now felt like theirs rather than his mother's or his childhood home, and they argued playfully about where furniture should go and whether his terrible landscape painting should really be hung in the living room. That night, they slept in the bedroom that had been his as a child, and it felt simultaneously strange and completely right, like finally inhabiting a life he had been circling around for 20 years. They did not rush into marriage or grand gestures. They simply built a life together day by day, choice by choice. She kept her house for a while, maintaining her independence, but gradually more of her things migrated to his place until it became clear that they were living together in all but name. They worked in the garden together, slowly reclaiming it from the wilderness, planting vegetables and flowers. They hosted dinners for friends, sat on the porch on summer evenings, took long walks through the town that had brought them together, and then let them go and now welcomed them back. There were adjustments to make. He had lived alone for so long that sharing space required conscious effort, remembering to communicate about plans, to consider another person's preferences, to negotiate the 1,000 small decisions that make up domestic life. She had her own patterns and rhythms, her need for quiet in the mornings, her tendency to stay up late reading, her particular way of organizing the kitchen. They learned to accommodate each other, to find compromises that honored both of their needs. His sister visited that first summer and was surprised to find them so settled, so comfortable with each other. She pulled him aside one evening and said, "You seem different, happy." He had not realized how visible the change was, how much lighter he felt having finally claimed what he had wanted for so long. His sister knew about that summer, had heard their mother mention it over the years, and she looked at him with something like relief and said, "I'm glad you finally did something about it." They went back to the lake sometimes, on weekends when they needed to escape the house and the constant small projects they had taken on. They would sit on the rocky shore and talk about their weeks, about the students in her classroom and the projects he was working on, about their plans for the garden and whether they should repaint the porch. Ordinary conversations about an ordinary life. Except that for both of them it felt extraordinary, this simple act of building something together. In the fall they took a trip to the coast, renting a small cottage for a week. It was the first real vacation either of them had taken in years, and they spent the days walking on the beach, reading, cooking elaborate meals, just for the pleasure of it. One evening, sitting on the cottage porch watching the sunset, she said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had done this 20 years ago?" He considered the question carefully. He said, "Sometimes. But I think we would have made a mess of it. We were too young, too uncertain about who we were." She nodded slowly. "I think you're right. I think I needed those years to figure out what I actually wanted, not what I thought I was supposed to want," he said, "and I needed to learn that staying silent doesn't protect anyone. It just creates a different kind of pain." She reached for his hand. "We found our way back. That's what matters." When they returned home, autumn was settling in, the oak trees turning brilliant colors, the air crisp and clear. They spent weekends raking leaves and preparing the garden for winter, working side by side in that comfortable rhythm they had developed. His mother's house, which had felt haunted by memory when he first returned, now felt alive again, filled with new memories being made every day. In December, a year after he had first come back to sort through the estate, they threw a small party. Just a few close friends, her colleagues from the school, some people he had reconnected with since moving back. They served mulled wine and roasted vegetables from their garden, and people filled the rooms with laughter and conversation. At one point, he stood in the kitchen doorway watching her talk with a group of friends, animated and bright, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost knocked him over. This life they were building, this second chance they had been given, felt like the most precious thing he had ever held. Later that night, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up, she said, "Your mother would have loved tonight. She always wanted this house to be full of people." He thought about his mother, about all those Sunday phone calls, about the way she had gently pushed and prodded, never giving up hope that he might find his way back to happiness. He said, "I think she knew, about us, about what might be possible If we were brave enough. She smiled. Mothers usually do. They finished cleaning and sat on the couch in front of the fireplace, the last remnants of the party cleared away, just the two of them in the quiet house. He thought about all the paths he had taken to get here, all the years of wandering and wondering, all the careful defenses he had built to protect himself from wanting too much. And he thought about how all of it, even the pain and regret, had led him to this moment, to this woman beside him, to this life they were creating together. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "How lucky we are to get this, to get another chance." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We made our chance. We were brave enough to try." And that, he thought, was the truth of it. They had not been rescued by fate or luck or divine intervention. They had simply, finally, chosen to reach across the distance that separated them and claim what they had always wanted. It had taken 20 years and immeasurable loss, but they had done it. They had found their way back to each other and to the house that had always held their unspoken love, waiting patiently for them to be ready. Some stories do not have tidy endings. Some love does not arrive on schedule, wrapped in certainty and clear directions. Sometimes it comes late, tentative, shaped by all the years of silence that preceded it. Sometimes it requires more courage to claim than seems possible. But it is still love. It is still real. And it is still worth everything it costs to finally speak the words that matter most. If you have ever stood at the edge of saying something true and pulled back, if you have ever let fear choose your words, if you have ever wondered what might have been if you had been braver, this story is for you. Your words matter here.